Hello and welcome to the AUBG Office Hours podcast. Just a second. Today I have with me a newcoming member of the AUBG faculty who is renowned as a freelance journalist and who has worked for Esquire, Outside, The Nation, The Atlantic, and many other papers and magazines. He's also a poet, a literary critic, and a translator, and has recently become a professor at our institution. Please welcome to the show, Professor Dimiter Kenarov.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Okay, we'll start with a few quick questions. First of all, maybe you can just introduce yourself at a wider scope before we delve into it.
Yeah, sure. My name is Dimiter Kenarov, and I'm a freelance journalist and a writer. I was born in Sofia, Bulgaria. I grew up in Sofia and went to high school, the American College. And then I went on to do a bachelor's degree in American and Russian literature at Middlebury College, Vermont, in the States. And then I did my master's at the University of California at Berkeley. And after I left, basically I started my freelance career. I moved back first to Sofia, then to Istanbul. I've lived in many other places as well. But yeah, so that's what I'm doing. I'm basically freelancing for various, mostly American publications.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Maybe we can go step by step. First of all, when did you become part of the AUBG faculty?
Oh, this is my first semester, actually. I've been thinking about teaching here for quite a while, and I was actually supposed to teach the previous semester, but then I had some work to do, and so I started in the spring. But I'm enjoying it very much. I find the level of education here particularly high, and because I've taught at institutions in the States as well. I've taught at Middlebury College, my alma mater. I've taught at Oberlin College and at Berkeley, and I'd say that the students here, the undergrads level is pretty damn good.
Oh, yeah. Okay. We'll go back to that in a bit. Teaching in the journalism department.
Mm-hmm. I'm teaching JNC, yeah.
And what are you teaching exactly?
I'm teaching this semester a class on creative nonfiction with particular focus on literary journalism, basically what I'm doing, my profession. And so it's both sort of a critical survey of some major texts of literary journalism, and at the same time it's also a creative writing class. So students are both encouraged to read sort of the best kind of examples of that genre, and also to write their own work.
And you tailored that course by your own, like you constructed the curriculum, if I understand correctly.
Yes, of course. So I try to basically adjust the curriculum as we go along, because I feel that sometimes and because it's my first time teaching this class, I feel I need to get a feel of, where students' interests lie and all that. And I'm adjusting the syllabus as we go along. But I think this is actually the better way to do it.
Mm-hmm. And you say, so you teach, this is the first time you're teaching this kind of course. And then what did you teach back when you were in the States?
Well, I've taught various classes on literature classes back at Berkeley when I was a grad student there, because I was doing also a PhD, which I dropped out in order to start my journalism career. But anyway, I've taught also, because back in 2014, I was covering the takeover of Crimea and the annexation of Crimea by Russian troops. So I was in Crimea back then, working for various magazines, Foreign Policy and The Nation and The Atlantic. And so I was covering the Crimea crisis back in 2014, and also the war in East Ukraine afterwards. So I ended up actually teaching a class on the sort of literary and cultural and historical background in Crimea, sort of that kind of class, where I was trying to provide students with sort of a grasp of both the cultural sort of things that were happening in Crimea, but also the international context and the political context currently.
So that was kind of the focus on kind of historical and cultural analysis.
Historical and cultural narratives, yeah.
Okay.
And we're looking at various points of view, sort of like what, certain, let's say Western media, how they cover the conflict. Back, it was before this current war, of course. And also we were looking at Russian narratives and so trying to introduce students to how, history is fought online and in various narratives.
Yeah, but this was so journalism was kind of what you progressed into doing. But you originally, I think you've taught us in class that you originally studied literature before
right.
that. Yeah.
So the kind of journalism I'm doing, I don't do news journalism very much. I do what's called literary journalism. Sometimes it's called long form or literary nonfiction. It goes by different names, and basically it's a genre where you combine real events, facts, characters with sort of literary techniques, and you create actually a real story that's well told. Let's put it this way. So it is a kind of genre that does not really exist in Bulgaria very much. They're not. I would say there aren't almost any venues actually that publish this sort of journalism, but it's very popular in the States, especially with big magazines like the New Yorker and the Atlantic and Harper's and so on. So that's the kind of journalism I'm doing, and I'm trying to combine my interest in literature and in storytelling with actually my original reporting on the ground.
Yeah. Do you think it's kind of maybe it's progressing and it's kind of coming to our end as well, or if is there a prospect of that happening?
Well, that's a complicated question. Actually, early in the 90s, sort of mid 90s, there was a magazine in Bulgaria called Egoist, which used to publish stories of that sort that were sort of a mixture between fiction and nonfiction, so to speak. That is not like fake news or whatever, but just nonfiction written with literary techniques. But then the magazine folded, or at least changed completely, and there haven't. I wouldn't say. I mean, there's like Biograph and a couple of other places where you could see sometimes longer stories like that. But generally, I feel it's probably not coming back just because narrative, or at least this kind of written narratives are disappearing because of the predominance of audiovisual culture. And so the movement is actually a little bit away from, not a little bit, quite a lot away from print into visual and audio formats. And I sometimes feel like I'm kind of teaching a kind of a disappearing craft, but that's okay.
Wow, that's really interesting. For me, before I took this course, because I'm taking it right now with you, I didn't even know that this kind of journalism even existed as a separate thing. I thought it was like distinction between fiction and non-fiction was like self-help books and then fantasy.
Yeah.
You mentioned that a lot of the things that you mentioned were kind of part of like Eastern Europe, Crimea, Russia, Ukraine, and even before recent events. And I remember you've also taught us one of your pieces. So do you have some specific preference over the region, over like Eastern Europe, or like?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the reason I came back, actually, to a certain extent. I mean, a lot of my friends. I graduated high school in '99. So a lot of my friends left for the States and never came back. I mean, you cannot blame them because they've started their own lives, their families, and so on. But I was always interested in this region, just because I think it's a wonderful position when you're both an insider and an outsider. And I've lived long enough outside of Bulgaria to sort of look at this region a little bit with the eyes of a foreigner. Yet I do speak the language. I do speak Russian as well, and I, Serbo-Croatian. A lot of Bulgarian, especially if you speak two Slavic languages, you kind of understand as well. And so I was not that interested in Bulgaria per se, but in the region. I'm more interested in regions. I hate nationalisms or any kind of national borders. So I prefer to look at things more from a regional perspective. So kind of the Balkans and the Black Sea region. These are the places that I've always been interested in. And when I came back from the States, I decided that I have this sort of double focus of the insider and the outsider, and that would be a good way to approach my subject.
On approaching your subjects, how do you work? What does it consist of? Like, because with news reporting, of course, you have to be there, but with literature journalism, I guess it's a bit more sophisticated.
It's more sophisticated. It's very different approach, actually. Since I'm a freelancer, I don't work for a particular magazine. I usually write the stories that I'm interested in, not that somebody else is interested in. That is like not an editor, assigning me stories. I usually, sort of comb the news for various stories that I'm interested in and various kind of things that, sort of, get my attention. And so if I find a story like that, I usually start researching what sort of the background and what's going on there and so on and so forth. And if I find that I actually have the possibility of covering that kind of story, I start, you write a pitch, which is usually 500, 600 words to an editor. And then you send out the pitch to different editors. And sometimes, oftentimes you get turned down, especially at bigger magazines. But you try this magazine, that magazine, so on and so forth, until you find somebody who's interested in that story. Now, sometimes nobody's interested. There are situations like that where you have two options: either to sort of drop the story and move on to something else, or if you're really, really interested in that thing, then you go and you report it, and then you write it, and you try to find a venue afterwards, after you've written it. But that's the harder way. Usually, the best way is when you get like an editor interested, and then the approach of the magazine. Usually, different magazines have different so-called house styles. So, for example, Esquire magazine, for which I've written back in 2010 when I was a war reporter in Iraq, that would have more of a kind of adventure angle. Then you'd have a more, if it's the Atlantic, then they'll have more of a political kind of analytical angle. So you'd have to know the kind of publication you're writing about, and that's how you can sort of gauge your style and your approach better.
So there's a lot of places where things can go wrong.
Yes.
In the process.
It almost always goes wrong.
Really?
Yeah. That's the beauty and the horror of it.
Uh-huh.
It's you have, there's always somebody who doesn't want to speak to you, or the story falls apart. When you go there, it's nothing like what you've imagined. And this is part of the craft, is really to try to write the best story you can with the material you have. And this is really the main difference between fiction and nonfiction. It's not really that one story is invented and one story is not. This is an important distinction, of course. But to me, because nonfiction as well, it is a kind of a literary, how should I say, a literary product as well. You have a frame, you have certain points of view that are represented there. So although it's based on real facts, oftentimes there is a big subjective element as well. A lot of journalists, of course, do not like to admit that, but there is a big subjective element. But to me, the biggest difference between fiction and nonfiction is exactly this, that in nonfiction, it's like you're riding in the driver's seat of a car, and somebody else is like at the wheel, and you just have to go along, and you're not allowed to choose the direction. You just have to go in whatever direction you're driven. And so you're a little bit powerless sometimes to do anything. Really. And when you're a fiction driver, you're mostly like behind the wheel of the car. So you can choose, you can go left or right, here or there. So in a sense, it's the lack of control as a nonfiction writer that I enjoy. In fact, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because you studied literature extensively, but then you switched to something that is, most literature, it's like fiction. So, like, I was wondering what was the main reason, but that kind of really reveals that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fiction based on sort of, real stories. And if you take, War and Peace, even like the big novels that we have, oftentimes are based on historical events or sometimes on the writer's own lives. But then they can pick and choose, really, how they can, like, the story in fiction can be based on a real event, but then you invent on the details, or you take the story in completely different direction plot-wise. With nonfiction, that's what you're not allowed to do. You cannot, if it doesn't rain, you cannot make it rain. Even if it's a better symbol or whatever for the narrative, and that kind of lack of control, you're really the toy of fate, so to speak, and to relinquish the sort of the control over the narrative or over what happens is really both terrifying but also very satisfying in a sense. Yeah.
When you were starting out, did this kind of like frustrate you or phase you out when you were just beginning, like doing your journalistic work, or was it the thrill kind of exciting you?
No, it still does. It's like super frustrating. If you go somewhere and you've like imagined what the story you'd like to write about, what the angle is, and then you see that things are falling apart. It is always terrifying, and you're always on the verge of giving up. And so it has never, that sort of terror has never left me. But it's also, I'm some people say if you're afraid of bears, do not go into the forest. I'm afraid of bears and I go into the forest anyway, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Makes sense. Face your fears, maybe.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Maybe you've also done, I read in your bio on your website that you also did translator work.
Yeah.
What kind of text have you translated?
Well, actually, most recently I translated yesterday. I translated a big essay by a Russian writer for Dnevnik, the Bulgarian newspaper. But it's called The Russian Question. It's really Maria Stepanova is the author, and she left Russia back at the beginning of the war in March. But she's written an excellent essay about what it means to be a Russian these days. And it's a very harsh look on herself and on what it means to be Russian. And it's an extremely powerful essay. But so I translate mostly from English, actually. Russian is sort of sometimes I translate from Russian, but more rarely. So I translate. I have two books of translated poems. By one is Elizabeth Bishop, one of my favorite poets. She was writing in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. And then the other, which came out recently, is by Jack Gilbert, another American poet. So I started out my literary career really as a poet, and I sort of moved to journalism kind of by chance, really, as things happen in life. But yeah, so poetry is my first love, and I still write poems, and I still love translating poems. Because it really, the most important thing about poetry, I mean, there are many things you can write in prose, and then you can write in poetry as well, but I like the sort of the attention that we give to each and every word in poetry, and the attention we give to the language and to the rhythm of the language. And I think if you can transfer that sort of love of the language to prose, then it's something beautiful can come out of it.
Well, maybe we can jump back. Actually, first of all, you, like poems-wise, you also have published some of your own work.
Yeah.
Well, but have you written for? Because one of them, I remember I read online, it's like
Apokryfni животни.
Yeah. So, like, are you a fan of nature, the animals, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. I'm extremely interested in animal rights.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is one of the biggest crimes of humanity is our approach, our slaughter of animals, and we are oftentimes we we have pets, and we're like, oh, dogs and cats. I mean, they're wonderful creatures. I have 2 dogs, but we don't think about, farm animals, for example, and the billions of farm animals that are getting slaughtered every year, and we've turned them into this like machines, this sort of inanimate objects that are there for our delight, and for our delectation, if we, but in fact, if you look at, for example, the animal industry, industrial farming, it's perhaps one of the greatest contributors to environmental degradation, and from the whole cycle is just horrendous. If you look at the way territories are being deforested in order to raise fodder for animals there, the kind of pesticides that are put into the soil to raise those crops. Then you take those crops to feed the animals, and the kind of unethical, terrible treatment of these animals, the kind of terrible treatment they're subjected to. Then the feces and sort of the byproducts. I mean, it's I sometimes feel that we're even on the terribly on the wrong path with sort of the green economy and the way we try to change the climate by emphasizing electric cars or production of electricity through like renewable sources like sun or wind. But we're not changing the patterns here really. Yeah, we're maybe getting rid of some of the greenhouse gases, but on the whole it's just moving from one kind of consumption to another kind of consumption. And I think that actually we can improve greatly the future of our planet if it's not even about going vegetarian. It's about decreasing our diet, decreasing our reliance on meat by even 20%. It would make a much bigger difference than putting the whole world on like wind power, just because you'll save so many forests, like so much energy from raising crops and so on and so forth for the fodder. And basically, and not to even speak about the kind of, that we're going to decrease the suffering of animals. And so to me, that topic is extremely important, and I feel very strongly about it. And that's why I wrote a book of poems about animals, to give you a long answer of this like very short question that you posed.
Yeah, that's a really strong kind of background motivation behind this, and it's also another, from what I'm interpreting, it's about a social problem that is happening, and it's kind of, even though it's fiction this time around, it's still tackling this thing.
Well, it's not. What do you mean by fiction?
I mean because it's poetry, it's not fiction.
Well, it is in a sense, but also it's not a fictional problem at all, right? It's more of an emotional way to treat, I guess, the question of animal rights rather than going through nonfiction. But yeah, it's a problem that we don't speak about because we don't want to change our diet. As long as we can continue our old consumption habits, we're okay. But if anybody asks us to like change a little bit of our behavior for the benefit of the planet, that's when we bow. That's when we say, oh, we cannot do that. And to me, that's the biggest problem, actually.
Yeah, I see. I agree. It's also, I've read also these reports about, going green and the green economy and everything in the future. It's like, we just stay the course, but we do some little adjustments. So
I think it's a big scam, the green economy.
It is.
That's how I feel about it. I'm sorry to say it. A lot of my friends are into this kind of thing where the green economy is going to save the planet. It's not. It's degrowth is going to save the planet. The decrease of our consumption is going to save the planet. But if we just want to continue with our lifestyle and just by substituting one sort of energy for another, that's not going to do much, really.
I understand. Well, maybe we can kind of take a step back and talk about like high school education, because I'm really interested to hear about like the American college and how that was. And do you find, maybe you've been here for a short while, but still, do you kind of find resemblances between what we like the whole system, the way it functions here at the university and what it was back when you were a student there.
When I was accepted to the American college, that was 1994. They had just, I was the third class actually. There wasn't even yet a graduating class yet. So there were very few people there, just 300 people altogether. And only 2 buildings were fully functioning. The rest were still under construction, or they were not part of the campus yet. So and it was interesting because it was the sort of I had some amazing teachers, Harvard grads and like from Yale and so on. These were the first Americans that came into Bulgaria after the end of the Cold War. And they were very motivated. And it was a madness for them because, there was hyperinflation in Bulgaria and crime and everything. But, the people who came in here, the Americans who came in here in the 90s were the most adventurous types. And I think that was a great thing. The American college and what I liked back then was actually the fees were nominal. Right now, from what I've heard is actually that the fees are pretty high, and not many people can afford them. But then it was a little bit more democratic. I think at first it was like $400 a year or something like that. So I like that. There was, right now there is a huge social gap in Bulgaria between the rich and the poor. In the 1990s, still, people were equally poor, so to speak, and you didn't have that social gap yet. But I had classmates from all over the country, and really there wasn't a sense that somebody's like richer than the rest or whatever. You would have like the occasional guy who's like the son of a mafia type or whatever, but generally it was beautiful. What the American college taught me is to oppose authority or to question authority, and I think that's the good part about the American system, is that you're taught to think for yourself and to have the guts to come out and say, I don't like this, or I want to question the arguments and of a certain author, let's say, or a certain authority. And I think the problem with the Bulgarian system is that it's, sometimes it's very rigorously based on fact, which is fine, but people are not taught to think for themselves or to actually to oppose other points of view. Generally, they're taught to agree with the dominant point of view that they're taught. So anyhow, it's I think that's the main takeaway for me.
How did they? That's what they taught you, to kind of oppose authority. But how did that happen? So was it through critical thinking? Critical
thinking, essays. I honestly hated my Bulgarian literature classes. I would have never studied literature in college on the university level afterwards, but I loved my English literature classes just because the approach to literature was so different. We weren't taught to just regurgitate stuff, by critics. We had to do our own personal response to a certain kind of work or certain book, which I really liked. And this is where my love of literature comes from. It comes from I had this wonderful teacher as a junior, Kalinda Webb, and then Pamela Inlow, another wonderful teacher I had as a senior literature teacher. And they were the ones who really inspired me to love literature. And because you have your own, they respected your own sort of take on a literary work rather than, forcing you to regurgitate, the dominant perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess that love for literature then drove you to the States, or was it snowboarding?
Yeah. I've told you this in class. I was a big, snowboarding was a big part of my life when I was a teenager. I was actually part of the junior national team, and I was thinking of even getting, sort of going for like a professional career in snowboarding, but in the end, it's just a hobby. And so I was like, I want to go to a place where they actually had mountains and snow. So I did go to Vermont. But really, literature was what I wanted to study. And I've been reading right now, I just read this article in the New Yorker called The End of the English Major. which is a big piece, like 10,000 word piece. And sort of the main argument there was, not the main argument, sort of the main kind of information is that, a lot of students these days are, they like the humanities, they like history, they like literature, but they don't see any perspective in that. They don't see why they have to study that, and they prefer to go into the STEM, sort of science and engineering and technology. And I mean, when I was a student, studying literature was also kind of a gamble. Like, what kind of job can you find afterwards, and so on and so forth. But you did it anyway because you love that kind of material, and you love the humanities and love the way to start figuring out how the world functions, and sort of going in depth, not under the facts, what and how facts are constructed, and so on and so forth, and or narratives are constructed. But what really sort of made me sad was that there were so many interviews with students who said, who said that they did not want to go into the humanities because it was too risky, or they wanted a stable job. And I'm like, where's the spirit of revolution? Where's the spirit of daring? And if young people, I don't want to sound like one of those old farts who's like, basically criticizing the younger generation. But, usually the older ones would say, the young are so, they're listening to this terrible music, loud music, and they're being not very polite, and they don't respect their elders. I say, no, it's the opposite. My problem with the younger generation sometimes is that they're not disrespectful enough, that they don't like go out and do, I find a lot of young people very conservative, in fact. And I find them, and that's, I want to feel sort of the spirit of youth, that they're going to say, and they're going to say to older people, you suck. We have to like take our future from you and sort of build something else. And I find that sort of lack of daring a little bit disturbing, to be honest.
I have never heard that sort of criticism for my generation, and I love it. I think it's true. A lot of us kind of stray from this because we want, we're taught, do this, be safe, because I guess it's because of what our parents went through. And because most of them didn't get higher education.
And social media, I think, has actually created a bigger sense, a bigger sort of push for let's say for social agreement, to actually to try to be not to rebel, not to stick out, to try to I'm not expressing myself here very well, but to try to be part of a community and not to try to be an outcast. I think social media is putting this pressure on younger people that, they have to be part of this community. And if they express something else, then they're being thrown out or being, sort of made into outcasts. And I feel that sort of constant surveillance of social media is actually making people less daring, more prone to self-censorship than in an environment where you're not constantly under surveillance of your peers, of somebody else. So then you have a more of a sense of freedom, I would say, more space for rebellion because of certain kind of ignorance of that sort of social pressure, right? I'm not sure if I express myself rightly here, but I feel that actually that's sort of what I'm talking about, the lack of protest, the lack of different opinion oftentimes is a product of the greater presence of social media.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Maybe we can also say that at least what comes in my head as I hear this is that, sure, like historically, maybe the young generation is the one, or the generation that comes after the previous one is the one that creates the revolution or kind of changes how it goes. But historically, it's also been kind of scared to kind of speak up. Maybe not because in the past because of oppression, but today, as you say, it's like kind of social norms. It's kind of what it's like our generation creates for itself.
Yeah. I mean, this is the sense of conformity that really bothers me. And I'm like, why? And people say, oh, with social media we can express our opinions. But in fact, it creates a bigger pressure to conform rather than the opposite way around. I can see this with myself as well. I can see myself self-censoring oftentimes, because before that, even in articles, what's the worst thing that can happen to you? Somebody can write a letter to the editor. Oh, big deal, and that's part of the discussion. But once, if you come out on social media and say something that's even like trying to be more subtle, trying not to be on one side or the other, but trying to actually offer arguments that are rational and they are trying to bridge both sides, then you're being sort of showered with hate on both sides as well, and sort of you're being made into an outcast. And I think that sort of thing has created a greater potential for self-censorship among both old and young, I think.
Maybe that also kind of goes into the free speech aspect of it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's very subtle, so you don't really feel it, so you can't really point to it with a finger. But
yeah, I mean, because I study the communist period, I'm writing a biography of Georgi Markov, the Bulgarian writer and dissident who was murdered in London, the famous so-called the Bulgarian umbrella, was murdered in 1978 by the Bulgarian state security. And I've been very sort of interested in the period of the Bulgarian sort of socialism. And, it's interesting that a lot of people say, oh, it's the outright censorship. But in fact, when you look at the period, there was outright censorship early in the post-war period, let's say, from 1947 until like 52 or 53. But afterwards, it was a more subtle kind of censorship. It was, first self-censorship by the author, then the editor, he didn't want to put his career on the line to publish something, or even the publisher. In the end, the printing house would say, oh, we don't have enough paper for this book, so nobody really, there was no a lot of people have this image of communism, where there was this censor who stopped stuff, but actually it was more of an agreement among various layers of the society that they'll not publish certain kind of things. And if something ended up being published, then of course there were repercussions. Somebody would be denied the right to publish afterwards, and so on and so forth. But I found out that even in that period, the biggest problem was perhaps self-censorship rather than anything else. Yes, there were repercussions if you ended up publishing something, but the very fear of self-censorship is something that it's your own terrorist in a sense. You undermine your idea, you blow up your idea even before it's even before it's born. And I think that's the worst kind of censorship. It's not because it's easy. Actually, it's not that hard to go around regular censorship. You'd find a venue. You'd find somehow you'd maybe in another country, and so on and so forth. But self-censorship, it's something how do you get rid of your own censor inside yourself? That's, I think, the biggest problem of free speech.
That's very good wisdom. Wow. Have you kind of tackled this in your literary journalism? Well, you just said that you were writing.
Yeah. I have, and it's something that you think about. I try to, as best as I can, to express the opinions that I have in my journalism, regardless of the risks. But I can feel it in myself sometimes. You're wondering, should I write this? Should I write that? And so on and so forth. So there is the ethical question of that as well. Are you being honest with yourself? And again, it's like this thing what I said, I'm afraid of bears sometimes, but I go into the forest anyway. So you're afraid. I'm more afraid of being afraid, Mm-hmm. I think that's my greatest fear, is to think of myself as a coward. And that sometimes overrides the other fear. Let's put it this way.
Very good. Wow. Well, let's see. Maybe we can kind of switch the tone, and maybe you can tell us about your reporting, and what are some of the stories that you think that you imagine that don't have this serious political tone, but something that you did and was really fun to do? Would you say that there is such a story, or is it always something that is kind of tackling something social as an issue?
I think I've almost always tackled something that's political or social or environmental. There were always some stakes involved. I think there should be some stakes involved in a story. Otherwise, so I haven't really written like very personal stories that are just like a memoir of what I've I sometimes I insert myself in the stories and my point of view and some of my own biography. But unlike other writers who tend to focus on themselves mostly and use the story as sort of an excuse to talk about themselves, which is also great. Great stories can come out of this, but it's not my method, and so I usually need to have some kind of stake, whether social or environmental, So the story needs to be good, but also it needs to, sort of at least tackle some kind of issue that I find important.
Was that like kind of when you were starting? Well, maybe we can phrase this in this way. When you were starting out, did you kind of have this option to choose, what you wanted to write about, and was it exactly the topics that you were very passionate about discussing?
So it's interesting, the very first story I wrote was when Slobodan Milošević, the Serbian head of state, died in 2006, and he died in The Hague. He was being tried for as a war criminal because of the wars in Bosnia and also the wars in Kosovo. And so the first story came by chance, really. I was in Bulgaria and a friend of mine asked me to go to Serbia and to write this story about Milošević and Serbia after the death of Milošević. And it was more of a travel piece, really. And I had no idea how to do it. Absolutely. I had never done this kind of journalism. I had never done journalism in my life. And so I ended up just reverse engineering a couple of stories that he sent me and kind of like seeing how they're being written, what's like, how do you open the story, where do you include the quote. So it was a little bit of an autodidact. I self-taught person. So and that story, ended up winning the best story award of the magazine for the year. And then I ended up writing another story, which I chose this time. It was about the Roma in Bulgaria. And I was still studying in the States, but I came back and I ended up going through, because I was wondering why do we don't just so-called white Bulgarians, why don't they know anything about the Roma? It's all in stereotypes and all this stuff. And I'm like, why is this gap there? I want to learn more about this marginalized community. And I ended up actually finding somebody who was a Roma guy who was my age, and we ended up going through the various Roma communities around the country, and I ended up staying with them and kind of seeing them not like as human beings, not as they're being seen oftentimes as this sort of like foreign subjects or the foreign other. And I was very interested in that, and that helped me sort of, get into their world as well, and to mend some of my own ignorance. And so that story ended up getting into the Best American Travel Writing Anthology. Anyhow, so it's like there is a snowball effect. Once you do like several stories and they have success, it's easier to do other stories and to offer them to editors and say, I have this background, I have these clips, I have this stuff done. And so, that's how you never really plan it. I've never been like, I'm going to plan out my career in this and that way. I just go with the flow and whatever happens, really. But that's the way it happened, yeah.
I think it's really fascinating that the first pieces are already featured somewhere. Yeah. And they have good success. But I want to ask about the Roma piece. You ended up publishing it, I guess. Which magazine was it?
It's the Virginia Quarterly Review, VQR, which at the time was one of the best magazines for this sort of long-form nonfiction. The editor, Ted Genoways, who's a friend of mine, he, basically created from a small university magazine, he created one of the best sort of magazines for literary journalism at the time. That was in the late 2000s. and so I ended up publishing the piece there, but it was like translated and published in many other languages and then anthologized, and so that's how it happened.
Do you think it reached Bulgaria and like kind of? I guess it was translated in Bulgarian.
It was translated in Bulgarian. Actually, it's part of my. I have a book coming out this spring, which is a collection of some of my essays. I didn't translate them because I write mostly in English, and this at least my literary journalism is in English. So a friend of mine, Angel Igov, translated the book because I feel that I'd be a terrible translator of my own work. And when you have the sort of, when you translate your own work, you feel you have the freedom to change things as you go along. And that's very dangerous territory. So I prefer that somebody else actually do it. But anyhow, the Roma piece is included in that collection.
Very fiction, and not very non-fiction.
Yeah.
Can you? I would like, if you can, to elaborate on like some of the stuff you actually wrote in that essay, because it's also an ongoing thing here in Bulgaria. It hasn't really. I don't know. Actually, I'm not very educated myself. Yeah. So if you can tell me more about it, I'll be very happy.
Well, I mean, readers can go and look for it online. It's available. It's called Game Over, Perseverance, All I Want Is Everything. And the title comes from a T-shirt of a guy I saw, in one of the Roma communities. And it's like non sequiturs almost, like what? Game over, perseverance, all I want is everything. I was like, this is so strange. But then sometimes you just notice a strange detail like that, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna put this as my title because there's something very symbolic about it as well. But anyway, I mean, it's hard to summarize this kind of long piece in several sentences, but it feels that I mean, obviously there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of prejudice that's been around for centuries. And no matter, so the political regime, whether the communist regime or other regime, these people have always been somehow like a foreign other for Bulgarians, and they've been pushed aside. And nobody has really, I mean, there are all these like people trying to do TV or whatever broadcasts about them, but that's very, it's like, oh, I'm going to go into the community for 5 minutes, shoot this and get out of there. But in order to understand the internal workings, which are just as complex as any other community, you have poor people and rich people and like various kinds of social interactions between them. It's not just like one community. It's like a community that's made of various kinds of social groups that are sometimes fighting between each other and so on and so forth. But I guess one of the biggest problems is that because there is not a lot of racial difference, let's put it this way, in between Roma and Bulgarian, unlike African Americans, for example, where it's hard to escape being an African American, and that's why you have a lot of writers and sports people and so on who are being lauded as sort of the representatives of the community and so on, and they lift up everybody else, even if these people have been pushed to the ghetto and so on. When you have representatives like that, writers, Ralph Ellison, let's say, or Richard Wright, these famous African American writers, then they lift up the whole community. And oftentimes in the Roma community, what happens is that anybody who's successful, they immediately move to sort of the Bulgarian community, and they blend in because you can understand them because you're a professional dentist or a lawyer, and then you don't want to be associated with your group because there's so much prejudice against it. But what that also creates is a sort of that the what we call Roma are the most marginalized of the Roma, so to speak. And I think that kind of representation, they're denied that kind of representation. People don't know that they're famous Roma, but they are all around us. And yet we don't make that connection. And we think of the Roma as this like really only like the poorest group. And that additionally marginalizes that group. And so that's, for example, that's one of the things that I also explored in my piece.
What a comparison. Yeah. Wow. Great stuff.
Where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here? That was kind of wow. Okay. Maybe we can kind of go towards the conclusion of this session, and maybe you can kind of talk about freelance journalism as as a profession, as a career, and how it differs from being part of a magazine.
I think it's a very particular, the kind of work. I mean, it's hard for me sometimes to recommend, do this type of career. As I said, I'm not a professional journalist. I didn't go to a journalism school. I got into journalism more out of a love of literature and of writing and of storytelling. That's I think I'm a storyteller of facts, so to speak. But I think that's an important distinction. And the other kind of journalism, the news journalism, is extremely important, of course. I based a lot of my stories, I learn a lot about like what happens somewhere from a news article, and then I end up exploring more and more. But you need those journalists more than ever. The thing is, it's a tough career, as we've seen. The internet has pretty much destroyed the revenue of traditional media. We know that, but even online media is in dire straits right now, just because people are getting a lot of their information through Facebook and social media. And now we have ChatGPT, and then we have AI, and AI actually ends up writing some scarily good news pieces. And I think that I don't know what the future of journalism is really. To be honest, I cannot say you have to get into journalism or not. I mean, I'd say get into journalism, because that helps you to find out more about the world, and more about a world that you're not familiar with. Because every story, in a sense, you get to live the lives of your characters and get out of your comfort zone. So I think, but that's an important thing to do. But I cannot say what the future of journalism is. It's a little bit scary, I have to say. And with AI, we're looking at a big revolution, not smaller than maybe what the invention of the internet created in the 90s. And who knows? I mean, a lot of those sort of mid-level jobs are going to be taken over by artificial intelligence. So I don't know. I mean, this is a whole other issue that we have to think about. But I think the real sort of being on the ground is the most important thing. Being a journalist, just like by reading articles about stuff and by sitting in your office, it doesn't work. But being there, seeing it with your own eyes and trying to be honest, that's the most important thing with yourself, with the story, with your characters. I think we need more of that.
It's really inspiring, and I think it's also a great point to conclude this. Thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thank you for having me, really. Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thank you. And see you in class in a bit.
See you in class.